By the way, has anyone ever tried to put music to the Rescue Rover theme song lyrics? What, you didn't know this game even had a theme song? Well, I mean, it has the lyrics to one? So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the history of id Software by this point. The guys behind it were working for Softdisk Publishing, making games for their Big Blue Disc subscription service, realized they were better suited to making games on their own, and thus left Softdisk to form id Software. The thing is, though, they were contractually bound to continue making games for Softdisk for some time following. This is how the Catacomb 3D games came to be, but there were a handful of others as well, including today's ancient DOS game, Rescue Rover. Now, this game tries to bill itself as a totally new kind of experience, but the reality is that it's a pretty typical action puzzle game, with similarities to older games like Chip's Challenge and The Adventures of Lolo. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. Following an established formula simply means that you're less likely to have either a winner or a stinker. But there is unfortunately a fundamental flaw with this game, which can make it needlessly frustrating for first-time players. Once you know what to do, it's not so bad, and the only thing that's going to really trip you up then is that the controls are not 100% responsive, so you can't be too quick with your inputs, or you might end up making more mistakes than you'd otherwise expect to. Also, one little side tangent before we move on. Anyone who's played this game before is probably looking at the graphics and realizing something seems off. Well, that's because the game does some palette cycling tricks to make some of the graphics feel more lively, except, well, I'm going to pull up some footage of an unaltered copy of the game over in the corner, and once again, I'm going to slap a low contrast filter over it before I set it in motion so that I don't sear anyone's eyes out when I start the footage now. Yeah, given how pervasive the color cycling is throughout the entire experience, I really didn't want to subject everyone to having to watch that. So I looked into hacking the executable myself, but in so doing, grabbed the attention of Foon Turing over on social media, and they went ahead and put together a hack of the game which reduces the palette cycling down to what you see here. You'll find a link in the video description to grab the patched executable for your own copy of the game if you too want to experience it without angering the epilepsy overlords. Rescue Rover was developed by id Software and published as a standalone title through Softdisk Publishing back in 1991, and is a one-player action/puzzle game. Now, it only supports EGA 320x200 16-color graphics and PC speaker sound, and as for its current release date, it's actually still commercial, with the current license holder being Ziggurat Interactive. Which doesn't surprise me, they've routinely been buying up and re-releasing a lot of forgotten titles. In any event, digital downloads are available on both GOG and Steam for $10 as a collection of both the first and second Rescue Rover games together, which actually seems kinda high to me, all things considered, but then they frequently go on sale for half that price, so I guess it's not really that big a deal. As for physical copies, though, yeah, they pretty much don't exist anymore. You'll occasionally find overpriced discs from old shareware vendors which may or may not have the full game present, seeing as there is a shareware version of the game out there featuring only the first 10 levels. But as for official discs from Softdisk, I wasn't even able to find a photo of one, much less one for sale. So if you go searching for physical copies, do bear in mind you aren't going to find much, and what you do find may not be the full game. There's actually a tiny bit of story to this game to help set the scene. Here we have Roger and his dog Rover. Some evil robots keep coming up to dog-nap Rover, thus it's up to Roger to follow the robots to their lairs, rescue his dog, and successfully make it back out the same way he got in. The trick, though, is that the robots steal Rover not once, not twice, but 30 times before they finally realize it's not worth the effort and give up trying. So yeah, there's 30 levels in the game in total, and while you do technically have to play them in order, you're able to go back and continue from any level you've previously cleared. On top of that, each level is tracking how many attempts you need in a row to clear them. You can kind of use my final tally here to get an idea of just how hard or easy some of the levels are, though for the most part, the level of difficulty is not the issue, as the mechanics in play are actually pretty simple. The only controls in the game are directional movement. Now, there's technically an option to set up 2 additional buttons when changing the controls, but those buttons don't actually do anything, are likely just a holdover from something else using the same control configuration window. The game is also surprisingly forgiving in terms of preventing you from making incredibly stupid mistakes, as the game will not let you walk into lasers or jump into water. I mean, the lasers can still punch a hole clean through Roger here if you push something in such a way which causes a laser to suddenly intersect with him, then heck, do it wrong, you can actually fry Rover as well. Though there's far fewer instances of this being possible. In fact, once Rover is following Roger, Rover acts as a blockade and can help prevent moving robots from coming into contact with Roger. The crux of the game really is pushing things. There are 4 kinds of pushable things you encounter across the course of the game: crates, balls, anti-gravity carts, and mirrors. The crates are able to block lasers and form platforms on the water which you can walk across. Balls will move unhindered once pushed until they either slam into something or sink into some water. Anti-gravity carts work just like the balls, except that they can travel over the water, while mirrors are similar to crates, but they have a reflective diagonal surface for altering the trajectory of lasers. The trick here, though, is that you have to be very particular of how you set up your mirrors, since if you set them up in the wrong order, you're very liable to fry yourself or Rover in the process. Mirrors also sink into the water if you push them over top. However, while dealing with the basic puzzle mechanics, you'll also have robots to worry about. Now, the robots come in 4 varieties: guards, troopers, patrols, and homing bots, though the instructions don't quite explain them all too well. The guards are stationary robots that'll always look out in one direction, and if you step in front of them, they'll instantly shoot you, forcing a restart. Troopers don't have any firepower and instead kill Roger on contact. However, they follow a very simple movement algorithm of following along the walls on their right sides, thus moving clockwise or counterclockwise around a room's edges, depending. Patrols are like a cross between guards and troopers, except they move quite a bit slower and are thankfully much less common. Lastly, the homing bots, despite their name, aren't really realized to any great extent, as all they seem to do is just move around at random and aren't used very often. Plus, each time they are used, there's usually a really easy way to neutralize them. Yeah, one of the things you're going to notice pretty quickly, especially since this even comes up in the very first level, is that those lasers aren't just deadly to Roger and Rover, they're deadly to their robots as well. By appropriately positioning the mirrors, or by moving a mirror while it already has a laser reflecting off of it, you can not only destroy the robots so that they're no longer a threat, but you can also destroy the laser turrets themselves, which is sometimes necessary in order to successfully clear a level. Now, earlier I mentioned there's a fundamental flaw with this game, but before we get to it, I want to bring up that list of my attempt counts again for the various levels. Now, based on these metrics, you would probably assume that levels 10, 23, 27, and 29 are the hardest levels in the game. But why is that? What makes certain levels easier or harder? Well, let's take a look at these 4 levels in particular. Level 10 has a quad of lasers with Rover stuck in the middle of their beams. In order to get to Rover, we have to interrupt at least 2 of these 4 lasers. But how are we going to do that? A lot of the mirrors in this level don't have a lot of options for pushing them around, if any. Plus, the size of the level really makes it hard to gauge what's going to happen when we push certain mirrors into certain positions. For level 23, it's pretty obvious where we have to go and where the boxes are going to end up, but the huge size of the level makes it difficult to tell how many boxes we're actually going to need and where we need to bring them from in order to make an appropriate path to Rover. For level 27, the lasers are traveling everywhere, and thus we don't have a really good idea of where we need to go and where we should be pushing the mirrors to prevent locking ourselves out of a solution, since the level's too big to see everything. And then for level 29, this happens to be a mammoth-sized level with a lot of things needing to be pushed into very particular spots, with some of the solutions to problems requiring us to manipulate lasers and balls across ridiculous distances, which wouldn't be so bad if we could see where everything was lining up, but because the level is so large, we can't. Yeah, in case you haven't figured it out yet, the fundamental flaw is the fact that there's no map. This turns what should have been a game about logically deducing solutions into trial and error, with the irony being that there's even a level in here which preys on this fact. Level 18 is literally a keycard maze and is only difficult because you can't see where all the keycards are. Meaning, if you open a barrier and end up in a dead end, you have to restart the level. It's just trial and error with no real challenge whatsoever, yet takes numerous attempts to clear. And yet if you had a map, you'd clear it on your first try easily. Level 18 is basically a level which shouldn't exist if this game were playing fair. Though to be fair, this problem with not being able to see the scope of a level of an action puzzle game prior to attempting to solve it is not unique to this game, and was a frequent problem with action puzzle games of this nature. And heck, if making a map was so hard, even just being able to pan the camera anywhere you wanted to would have helped. The point is, puzzle games are only fun when the challenge is in solving the puzzle. The moment the challenge comes down to not knowing the layout of the puzzle, and thus having to make wild guesses only for them to be wrong and having to redo the same steps over and over again, it stops being fun. It's analogous to if you were putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and the moment you put a piece down in the wrong spot, the entire thing scattered and shuffled, forcing you to start over. This gets especially egregious on level 29 though. That level is so big and requires so many precise steps to clear, yet requires so much trial and error due to the size, that it took me a grand total of 46 minutes to clear, despite only requiring 7 attempts to get it right, because my actual successful attempt took 9 minutes, and half of my attempts prior typically fell apart due to the tiniest mistakes around 90% of the way to the solution. Level 29 is not fun, because you are discovering more about the layout of the puzzle each time you make progress, meaning you are also discovering after the fact whether you've screwed yourself out of being able to clear the puzzle or not. All that said, I will say that most of the levels up until level 20 aren't too challenging once you understand the mechanics in play and ensure you scope out the levels as best as you can before attempting them. From 21 onward, things get kinda nuts, but even then, there's some thankfully simple puzzles along the way. With the final 30th level being surprisingly simple, seeing as it's just a crate-pushing puzzle, which demands you clear and build a path to Rover once you find him, without making it impossible to push the crates that you need to push. Overall, Rescue Rover isn't really that bad of a game once you know the layout of the levels, but the frustration factor is much higher than it needs to be in its latter half due to not being able to scope out the layout of the levels ahead of time, either with a map or with being able to pan the camera. And I'm about 99% certain the id Software guys realized this was a major design flaw, because a couple years following when they made Doom, guess what they put in it which few first-person games had prior and few had following? A freaking map! I mean, don't get me wrong, having a map is often an unrealistic expectation for any person if they were to find themselves in the same situations as many video game protagonists do. But again, these are games. Games are meant to be enjoyed, not feel like work, and having a map is one of the things which often makes a game more enjoyable, by allowing the player to plan ahead and not burn time repeating the same things over and over again simply due to not knowing what they're working with. Well, sure, there are times when showing a map preemptively could spoil the gameplay, but it really depends on the kind of game, the size of the world presented, the expectations of the player, and the consequences of failure. By those metrics, because some levels of Rescue Rover can only be cleared on your very first attempt by dumb luck, it absolutely needed maps or camera panning. But beyond that, the gameplay is serviceable and worth a try if you ever get your hands on it. Though I don't feel it's worth the $10 price tag that's been slapped on it nowadays. Definitely wait for a sale. Unfortunately, the skipping you would have seen throughout the course of this video is actually how the game normally works. While scrolling happens smoothly along the vertical axis and at half rate across the horizontal, Roger stops moving for a split second each time he reaches a tile, thus leading to the skipping. Made worse if you leave the cycles count set to auto in DOSBox. Thus I recommend a fixed cycles count of 6,000. And again, there's a link in the video description to grab the patch to hack out the egregious color cycling, but you still need a proper copy of the game to use said patch. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on October 11th will be a standard review, episode 349, where we're going to be taking a look at the most highly requested turn-based strategy game I haven't yet covered on the show, which means I think a lot of you know which one it's going to be. And a lot of you know I'm going to suck at it. But whatever, I'll do my best to give it a fair shot and determine if it has any technical shortcomings or exploits or whatnot. So be sure to stay tuned to check it out. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. If you'd also like to support the show directly and get some extra perks, then head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.